everyone, my name is Anchovies, and in this video we're going to be doing a Clorinde guide. So she is going to be one of the new upcoming 4-star characters in 4.7, and for this let's go ahead and first talk about Clorinde's role in the game. So Clorinde is definitely a dedicated on-field DPS unit. She is a character that is quite similar to Ryan Shogun in that she has her on-field time, but it's not super long to where it's something like Sino, where he is a dedicated hyper carry that likes to stay on field for a really long period of time, but rather she just has a duration that she can swap to on field, do her damage burst, and then swap back out. So now let's quickly cover Clorinde's talent. So Clorinde's normal attack talent is irrelevant to her damage because it contributes nothing to her damage output and has no relevance to how she actually functions in a lot of her gameplay. Most of her gameplay is consolidated in her elemental skill. So when you cast her elemental skill, she'll enter the night vigil state. So when she's in this state, her normal attacks become swift hunt pistol shots, whereas when you activate the skill blend again, she does impale the night dash attacks. In both of these methods, while she is in her night vigil state, are considered normal attack damage. For her swift hunt shots, if your bond of life is below 100% of her max HP, then each shot will increase her bond of life and can also pierce through enemies. If her bond of life is at or above 100% max HP though, then she'll just fire normal pistol shots. When you reactivate the skill button and do Impale the Knight, it'll have different effects depending on her bond of life, similar to her swift hunt shots. She'll just do a normal lunge if her bond of life is at 0% max HP. If it is less than 100% of her max HP, then it will just heal Clorinde based on the bond of life percentage, as well as dealing increased damage and performs the attack in a slightly larger AoE. And if her bond of life is at or above 100% max HP, then she will use the effect Impale the Knight Pact. And this basically enhances the aforementioned effects for if you have less than 100% of her max HP, meaning that when you use Impale the Knight Pact, you'll have more healing, more damage, and larger AoE. Additionally, while she is in the night vigil state, healing effects are converted to additional bond of life. So this makes units like, say, Baiju or like Chef Bruce both viable, but also to the point where they are not complete downsides to using her, and they do not negatively affect Clorinde's bond of life stacking while she's in her night vigil state, which is really good. And of course she is Uzia aligned, so for those who care about the Fontaine exploration, she is an Uzia aligned character. Her elemental skill has a 7.5 second duration with a 16-second cooldown. So this is slightly over 50% downtime, which is slightly unfortunate and does make her a unit to where you do swap in and then you do have a decent amount of downtime before you can actually go back to use her again. Meaning that especially in teams where you're using somebody like Clorinde that have longer durations, there may be some awkward periods within rotations, and cooldowns and durations just have occasional instances where they just might not line up properly. Clorinde's elemental burst less lightfall grants bond of life upon casting it, and it will deal 5 instances of electro damage in an AoE, and 2 of these instances will apply electro. This has a 15-second cooldown with a 60 energy cost, meaning that things like energy requirements are going to be on the lower side, especially if you're using a second electro like, say, Fischl. Going into her passives, for her first Ascension passive, so when anyone triggers an electro reaction, this will increase Clorinde's damage dealt by normal attacks and her elemental burst by 20% of her attack for 15 seconds. So this includes reactions like Electrocharge, Overload, Quicken, etc. Now do note that this is not like Nouvelette's Ascension 1 passive, where you have to trigger different electro reactions to stack it. You can just trigger the same reaction multiple times to stack the passive. This has a maximum of 3 stacks, which means up to 60% of her attack for this damage increase, and the damage increase caps at 1,800 damage, or equivalent to 3,000 total attack. So this attack cap makes it to where units like, say, Bennett for example, that give a lot of flat attack buffs, as well as the fact that he often uses sets like Noblesse Oblige, this can make Clorinde easily reach more than 3,000 attack, especially when your Bennett is well built, which means that using units like him can be a little bit less desirable simply because of the fact that you're just not getting any more benefit after you have more than 3,000 attack. For her Ascension 4 passive, so if her bond of life is at or above 100% of her max HP, then her crit rate increases by 10% for 15 seconds when her bond of life increases or decreases. This caps at 2 stacks or 20% additional crit rate, and additionally when she's in the night vigil state, the healing to bond of life conversion is increased by 100%, or another way to put it, it's doubled. So this is referring to the effect that I mentioned in her elemental skill, where I mentioned that healing effects are converted to additional bond of life instead of actually decreasing it. So the fact that this is further enhanced makes it to where this is definitely the case that you can use healers with Clorinde in teams, especially cases like Farina. Although of course using a healer, or I guess a super strong healer, isn't always necessary, but in cases where you do use one, this makes it to where this does not negatively impact Clorinde, and in some cases can actually be somewhat beneficial. Alright, so getting into her rotations and combos, So the main thing you want to do is reach at or above 100% Bond of Life, then you want to use her elemental skill press, again to use the Impale the Night Pact for maximum damage output and healing. So typically, and this is especially the case in her first rotation, or if you're using something like Thundering Fury, where you're basically never bursting because using burst isn't that worthwhile in these teams, you want to cast her skill button, then do 6 sequences of doing 3 normal attacks and her elemental skill press, and then at the end, if you're not using a set like Thundering Fury, then you can end it with her elemental burst. And then in following rotations, you can press her skill 2 times. The first time activates her Night Vigil state, while the second one immediately uses an Impale the Night Pact. Then you can do 5 sequences of 3 normal attacks and skill presses, and then at the end, you can do however many normal attacks that you have left in your Night Vigil state, and then again you can end it with her burst. Typically she likes to end her rotations with her burst every rotation, especially because of the fact that her burst only costs 60 energy, and especially when you are using a second electro like Fischl, her requirements are not too high to the point where it's not bad to use it, and especially the case that it gives Bond of Life when you use it, which gives it some level of incentive to use. But again, if you're using something like Thundering Fury, then you do not need to use it every rotation, and you can use it every once in a while. So now onto Constellations. So her Constellation 1, so when Night Vigil is active and electro damage from her normal attacks hits enemies, 2 Night Vigil shade coordinated attacks will summon. So these shades deal 30% of her attack as electro damage and will occur once every 1.2 seconds. And the damage from this is considered normal attack damage. This can trigger up to 7 times per Night Vigil duration, and the DPS increase from this constellation is equivalent to about 20% damage increase, making this constellation worthwhile for those who are planning to vertically invest in Clorinde. Clorinde's Constellation 2 essentially enhances her first Ascension passive, so instead of 20% of attack per stack, she now gets 30% of attack per stack. The caps still max out at 3 stacks, but the damage increase now has a cap at 2,700 damage increase. Of course, this is still equivalent to 3,000 attack, but now this increased scaling basically offers more damage from her Ascension 1 passive. And because of this DPS increase translates from around a 17 to a 24% damage increase, which makes this another significant constellation. And again, people who are looking at early vertical investment for Clorinde, these first 2 constellations are pretty good. For her Constellation 3, this increases her elemental skill talent level by 3. Now, although her elemental skill is basically where all of her damage, well not all, but most of her damage is coming from, this actually only really translates to less than a 10% DPS increase, hovering around the 5 to 7% range. It simply increases the scalings, and while that is nice, it is not the biggest deal in the world for Clorinde. For her Constellation 4, Clorinde's burst damage is increased by 2% for every 1% of her current Bond of Life. So this has a maximum of a 200% damage increase, or basically when her current Bond of Life is worth 100% of her max HP. And this is of course incentivizing you to use burst every rotation, although hilariously she's already doing that. This is even better. And when using rotations that can completely maximize on stacking Bond of Life, this especially makes this constellation very effective. And so this translates to around a 14% DPS increase for Clorinde. Clorinde's Constellation 5 increases her elemental burst talent level by 3. Now, although she has her C4 to increase that burst damage, just this flat plus 3 talent level upgrade is not too significant, especially taking into account the fact that her elemental burst in and of itself does not do the majority of her damage. So this roughly translates to around less than a 5% DPS increase for Clorinde. And then we have onto her C6, which like most DPS Constellation 6s are pretty good. So while she's in the Night Vigil state, her crit rate and crit damage is increased by 10% and 70% respectively. She will occasionally summon Glimbright shades that deal 200% of her attack as electro damage, and these shades will summon when either Clorinde is about to be attacked by an enemy, or she uses Impale the Night Pact. She can get up to 6 shades per Night Vigil duration, and an additional effect is that she will also gain damage reduction and interruption resistance while the Night Vigil state is active. So this gives her a ton of additional attack and application while also giving her some damage reduction that increases her survivability. And all of this translates to a huge DPS increase of around a 40 to 60% depending on the team composition and your build. So overall, in terms of breakpoints, C1 is definitely the general go-to at first, especially if you're only really looking for a quick vertical investment on a DPS character. However, if you think you really want to take it to the next step, then I would say it is worthwhile to get her C2 because it is just as, and if not more valuable than getting her C1. And then after those, you can just either aim straight for C6, but at C0, Clorinde by herself is already a pretty decent unit as is. Transitioning over to her builds, let's first talk about artifacts and mainly artifact set. So her best in slot generally is Harmonic Whimsy. Of course, it gives attack in the 2-piece effect, and in the 4-piece effect, she gains additional damage percent when her bond of life increases or decreases. And for Clorinde, she has consistent usage of increasing and decreasing her bond of life through her elemental skill presses, as well as her swift hunt pistol shots, so she can effectively maintain full uptime throughout the majority of her night vigil duration with this set. 4-piece Gladiator's Finale is a nice option if you don't have 4-piece Whimsy. It still gives attack and gives an unconditional normal attack damage increase, and overall just has relatively consistent performance, alongside the fact that it's been around so long that you probably already have a decent 4-piece set at this point, so you can just slot that onto Clorinde until you get a good 4-piece Harmonic Whimsy set. Echoes is in the same boat as Gladiators, again, a nice option if you have a good set. This also gives attack, however, the normal attack damage increase is conditional on this set, and this is mainly due to the ping and RNG dependency from this passive effect. And of course, this dependency on these two factors generally leads to varied performance, but on an average, this will perform equivalently to 4-piece Gladiators. Next up is Thundering Fury. Now, this is mainly best in slot in things like Quicken teams, and especially the case with Fischl. So we're talking things like either Quick Bloom or like Aggravate teams. This allows for Clorinde to do 24 to 26 second rotations that are slightly longer, and also do not require her to use her burst. And while this does sacrifice some of her personal damage output, generally speaking, it does have an increase on her team DPS output, especially because of the way that Fischl works with her things like Ascension 4 passive, and just her general application, especially once you get her higher constellations, this difference will be even more significant. And lastly, you can do 2-piece variations with things like 2-piece Thundering Fury, and then either attack or march as the hunter. And you can just use this if you don't have a good 4-piece set of any of the aforementioned sets. For her main sets, generally you want to run an attack stance. However, an EM stance is viable and in some cases better, especially in things like Quicken or Hyperbloom teams. For Goblet, you want to just run an Electro Damage Goblet, as well as a Crit Circlet. For substats, first meet her energy requirements, which I'll get into right after this, then go into Crit, then Attack, and then Elemental Mastery if you are using her in something like a Quicken team. Now for her energy requirements, this generally varies depending on who you are using in the team. So if you are using her with Fischl or she's in a mono Electro team, then she needs basically either no energy and at most up to 130 energy recharge. If you're using her with a character like Yamiko, then she might want to have about 120 to 140, and then with other Electro units, or if she is the only Electro in the team, this can range from 130 to 150% energy recharge, and potentially even more depending on if you have things like Favonius weapons or other energy alleviating weapons. Now getting into weapons, so the weapons that best work with Clorinde, generally speaking, are going to be weapons that either offer crit damage, give maybe minor crit rate increases, or offer normal attack or just general damage percent buffs. And something to keep in mind when you're considering weapon options with Clorinde is her passive from her Ascension 4 that gives her 20% additional crit rate. This can make things like using crit rate weapons more difficult to use without completely overcapping on it. So for this section, this is something that I haven't done in any of these other guides. I'm going to try to break this down into great weapons, good weapons, in sort of niche or just meh weapons. So starting with great weapons I think are amazing for Clorinde are something like Absolution, Haran, or Mistsplitter. These are weapons that give crit stats with higher base attack, and they offer either crit damage, some damage percent buffs, or both. For example, Haran gives a nice normal attack damage increase, and although it is a crit rate weapon, it has a slightly higher base attack, which means overcapping it is going to be less prevalent when you're using this weapon. And of course for her signature, it offers a 20% additional crit damage in its passive effect, and also gives damage percent when her bond of life increases, which is really nice. And for Mistsplitter, its main strength is the fact that it gives a lot of elemental damage percent bonus, especially when you start using her burst. It's just a nice general crit damage weapon. And in the 4-star department, great weapons are R5 Finale of the Deep and Black Sword. Finale of the Deep is an amazing weapon for Clorinde. Although it does give a lot of attack, this is actually fine because not only does this rarely make her overcap on attack in and of itself, but these attack stats are just generally really nice to have on her, especially when you account that she already gets an additional 20% crit rate. So most of your builds are probably already looking decent, even without trying super hard to min-max on crit stats. And having this additional attack from Finale of the Deep, and the fact that Clorinde can very easily trigger the passive effect and benefit from it, makes it a really nice free to play and generally her best 4-star option in most cases. Of course, if you have something like a highly refined Black Sword, then you can use that as well, as this also gives normal attack increase and gives some additional minor healing in the passive effect. Now of course this is a crit rate weapon, so you do kind of have to watch out, but it's not really that high of a stat, so it's not too much of a concern. Moving on to good weapons, these are weapons that, although they're not as amazing as the great weapons, these are still nice options to have if you just don't have these aforementioned options, or you don't feel like making them, like for example, let's say you don't feel like making an R5 Finale of the Deep, then what else can you use? So other weapons that you can use are things like other 5-star crit damage weapons, so like Uraku or like Splendor or like Light of Foliar Incision. You can use something like Primordial Jade Cutter in certain situations. You can use 5-star attack weapons like Summit Shaper, or you can use something like R5 Lion's Roar and things like Overload or Quicken Teams. And then in the niche and sort of meh tier, mainly we have the EM stat weapons. The first one that I want to go over is Freedom Sworn, because this one can actually be good, but it's specifically in Hyperbloom teams where she's triggering more Hyperbloom core damage. This is where this weapon can find a little bit more strength and can be somewhat competitive with the lower tier crit damage weapon options. However, outside of that, she really doesn't want to use this weapon too much. And then for other EM stat weapons, it's pretty much the same case. Now lastly, let's go over team compositions. Now again, something to keep in mind, units like either Bennett or even something like Kujosara are not necessarily as recommended in certain situations due to the fact that they can easily make Clorinde overcap on attack from her Ascension 1 passive. So that is something to keep in mind. However, they are still usable and you can still use them if you want to. They still buff Clorinde in multiple ways, they still give her the attack that she wants. It's just that of course they will make her overcap, but they're still fine to use if you want to use them. So first we'll cover Quicken Teams. Now these teams typically cover a Dendro, Electro, and an ammo unit for most cases. For your Dendro unit, you can use offensive units like Nahida or even like Dendro Traveler. And if you want to use a more defensive option, then you can use something like Baiju, Yao Yao, or Kirara. For the Electro slot, 9 times out of 10 you're usually picking Fischl because Fischl is just Fischl. She's just that good. But you can also use something like Yamiko or Beidou. However, if you do use either of these two, you may want to invest slightly more energy into Clorinde. She might need higher energy because of the way that their particle generation works. And then for animal units, you can opt for Kazuha, immediate go-to, although Sucrose can be competitive, especially in things like single target scenarios. Of course, you can also use units like Venti in large AoE content, or there's other animal units that can use Viridescent Venera effectively. The next team archetype is Quick Bloom teams. For Quick Bloom or Hyper Bloom teams, this generally makes up with a Dendro unit, a Hydro unit, and then either an Electro or a Dendro Flex. For Dendro, your main Dendro 9 times out of 10 is going to be Nahida. She provides the much needed Dendro application that these teams want to thrive, and also provides some external Elemental Mastery buffing that is beneficial for Clorinde as well as the other units in the team. For your Hydro unit, you can just use most Hydro units, but the general go-to are characters like Zincho, Yelan, or Farina. In your Electro Flex slot, typically you can use Fischl, but you can also use Yamiko, or even in some cases you can opt to use Kuki Shinobu if you really want to. And for your Dendro Flex, generally speaking this is going to be a defensive unit, so again, something like Baiju, Yao Yao, or like Kirara. The next team archetype is Overload. So this of course has to include Chevreuse because she especially makes these teams more viable, then at least one Electro unit, and then your last unit can be either an Electro or a Pyro Flex unit. So generally your main Electro options, you typically want somebody that sufficiently applies Electro, so yet again, something like Fischl or Yamiko for most cases. And then in the Flex slot, you can either use Fischl or Yai depending on which one you use as your first one. You can also use Beidou. In minor situations, if you really want to, you could do something niche and quirky like Raiden Shogun with Tenacity of the Millilith. And you of course can use C6 Kujosara if you really want to, although again, keep in mind, she can make her overcap on the attack. This is a similar case in the Pyroflex slot if you're deciding to use Bennett in that slot, as he also gives a lot of attack for Clorinde. In this place, you can also use something like Xiangling or C6 Toma. The next archetype is Electrocharge, or commonly referred to as Taser teams. This will typically include at least one Hydro unit, an Animal unit to swirl both Hydro and Electro, and then your last slot being another Hydro or Electro Flex, or if you really want to, you can also do another Animal Flex. For Hydro units, typically you want to do your common choices, so something like Zincho, Yelan, or Farina. There can be some use cases if you feel like using something quirky like Mona for some burst damage, or Candace at C6 for that additional application, as well as the fact that Candace at base provides a minor normal attack damage increase, although not significant. For your Electro slot, common choices again like Fischl or Yamiko. You can also use Beidou if you want to, although again, this will involve you needing more energy recharge because of the way that Beidou doesn't provide that much energy in the team. And for your Animal unit, you can of course again use something like Kazuha. You can again also use Sucrose as she gives Elemental Mastery buffing that is quite beneficial in these teams. And then of course you can also just use other Animal units that can proc VV sufficiently. And then the last team archetype is Mono Electro. This of course has 2 additional Electro units, with the last slot being an Animal unit. You can also do something like 1 Electro, 1 Animo, and 1 Geo, or some Flex if you really want to, although my personal recommendation in these teams is just to go 2 additional Electro and Animo. For your Electro units, you can pretty much do any of the 2 Electros that I've commonly mentioned within the previous teams. And for the animal slot, Kazuha is of course the premier option, and especially in these teams because of his damage percent buffs that he gives. This is especially beneficial in a team like a mono team, but you can still also use other VV units like Sucrose, Venti, or Lynette, or other units. Simply just depends on who's available. Alright, and that is going to bring this Clorinde guide to a close. Thank you so much for watching this in-depth guide. If you did enjoy or found it useful, then be sure to leave a like and subscribe down below for more Genshin Impact content. And until the next video, bye bye.